Hi, this is Heidi Burgess with the third in the series of Business as Usual, and this one I'm calling the blame game. This one is less of a business as usual trap for third parties and more so for disputants. One thing that we frequently see disputants doing is blaming the other, assuming that they are right and it's the other side that is entirely wrong or entirely at fault. If you are a mediator, I'm sure you've seen this a lot. So one person says, you messed up, you forgot, you're not good enough or smart enough or fast enough or whatever. And what kind of response does that elicit in the other person? Well, it elicits denial or defensiveness or guilt or shame or avoidance or insecurity or humiliation, lots of negative emotions. And instead of making things better, this tends to make things worse. So this diagram shows a circle, and that circle keeps on cycling and keeps on causing the conflict to escalate and does nothing towards resolving it. In addition to that happening in interpersonal conflicts, it happens in societal level conflicts as well. I mentioned in an earlier video Peter Coleman's book, The 5%. And in that book, Peter describes intractable conflicts this way. He says when the many different components of a conflict collapse together into one mass, into one very simple us versus them story that effectively resists change, that's when intractability happens. Well, that's basically the same thing. It's me or us who are being right and good and defining us as we, and it's you, them, who are wrong or evil, and we define them as the other. So, good, bad, right, wrong, evil, good, us, them, it's all the same blame game. Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen have written a book, I think about 15 years ago, I'm not really sure, that they called Difficult Conversations. And this book focuses entirely, pretty much entirely anyway, on interpersonal conflicts and ways to engage in difficult conversations more effectively. They make a very important distinction in this book between blame and what they call contribution. Blame is just what I talked about. It's judgment. It's the assertion that the other person is wrong, and it looks backwards at what happened and who was at fault. Contribution, they say, looks at understanding of how both sides contributed to the situation. It does look backwards, but it looks forwards as well. How did we each contribute to getting into the mess that we're in? And what can we do to change the way we interact so that this sort of thing doesn't happen over again? The costs of playing the blame game that they point out are: one, understanding gets missed. You never figure out really what went wrong. You just blame the other, they defend themselves, or they deny that they did anything wrong, and you're stuck in an escalating spiral. No understanding. Naturally, this hinders problem solving. The contribution system allows you to figure out what happened, and then you can problem solve to figure out how to avoid it the next time. The blame game doesn't get you there. And lastly, the blame game can hide a bad system. It may be that nobody was at fault, but the communication system or the expectation structure or the organizational structure or what else made it so neither side could do what they needed to do, and the problem developed. This can be discovered if you look at contribution. It won't be discovered if you play the blame game. So the advantages of the contribution approach are: one, it's easier to discuss because blaming somebody can be awkward and you know they're going to get defensive, and it encourages learning and improvement. Now, there are 3 misconceptions about contribution that often encourage people not to use it. One is people think that it only focuses on your side. So your image is somebody else did something wrong, left you in a really bad way, and why in the world should you want to focus on what you did wrong to contribute to it? You know they're at fault. Why should you take the blame? Well, you shouldn't. You should focus on how both people contributed to the situation. And if you didn't contribute much, that should come out. But you should at least consider ways in which you might have contributed to the misunderstanding, or different expectations, or whatever it was that led to the problem. Another assumption is that it ignores or tramples feelings. People tend to be very angry when things go wrong, and they tend to want to blame the other. That avoiding blaming the other does not mean that you have to hide your anger or your frustration or your fear. Rather, you can express it using what conflict resolvers refer to as I messages, not you messages. This will be familiar to many of you who watch this video. For those of you who don't, I'll explain it in a minute. Lastly, the third misconception about contribution is that it is essentially blaming the victim. That's not true. It removes blame from everyone. Now, you could argue, well, why should I remove blame from the other guy who I know is at fault? Well, even if you know full well they're at fault, it doesn't do you any good to point that out. They're likely not going to accept that. They're going to get defensive or humiliated. They're going to reject the blame, and you're going to end up in a situation where you can't problem solve. So even when the other side is to blame, using a contribution approach as opposed to a blame approach can usually result in a better outcome. So as promised, the difference between you messages and I messages. A you message is, you were late to pick me up. It assigns blame and it provokes defensive. An alternative, which I've used on occasion, is, I get nervous when we leave so little time to get to my class. Now, if you have a good relationship with the other person and you use an I message to focus on your feelings, that's going to provoke sympathy and a desire to fix the situation, either this time or the next time. So the outcome of an I message, which essentially says the same thing, because when the other person was late to pick me up, that left me too little time to get to class, the messages substantively are the same, but the emotional impact is very different. Now, I have a corollary to Peter Coleman's blame game. You may remember his diagram had me, us, good, right on the green side, and you, them, bad, evil on the red side. Sometimes we blame ourselves. This really jumped out at me after 9/11, when most of the United States was blaming Al-Qaeda. And some liberals and a number of conflict resolvers were blaming people in the United States, talking about how we brought it on. Well, that created a lot of resentment and anger and probably didn't win a lot of friends for our field. But both sides were getting us into trouble by focusing on blame and not focusing on contribution. So I've got a question for you. Consider a conflict in which you tend to place blame. You can stick with 9/11 if you want to. Or I've been thinking a lot about what we currently call the red-blue divide and the conflict between liberals and conservatives in this country. The tendency that I fall into a lot, I know, is to blame the other side. Both sides, liberals, tend to frame the situation as the problem with conservatives. Conservatives blame the situation on the problem with liberals. Consider how much differently our political discourse could occur if we dropped the blame game and we looked instead at contribution. What is the contribution of liberals to conservatives' sense of fear, anger, frustration? What is the conservatives' contribution to liberals' fear, anger, and frustration? And if we think in terms of contribution of both sides to our current polarized conflict, what effects might that have on our political discourse and our political system?